Alright. Tonight we're returning to the decks of the Mort Zestus, where strange happenings have been going on that have been growing increasingly dangerous. Howdy Rainbow Dash, howdy Frog Senpai. Last we were here, a storm had just hit, and the crew had to climb the masts to pull up the sails, so that they don't get torn and capsize the ship. Whilst they were up there, I'm trying to do this off the top of my head. One crewman fell, and another was seriously fell on top of another crewman, killing both. And one was nearly killed, and when they brought him down, he was not well. Now, the crew had to again go back up to finish the job, but some thing attacked the men up there, and now that's where we are. Alright. Chapter 11. The Search for Stubbins. In a confused way, I was conscious that the skipper and the mates were down among us, trying to get us into some state of calmness. Eventually, they succeeded, and we were told to go aft to the saloon door, which we did in a body. Here, the skipper himself served out a large tot of rum to each of us. Then, at his orders, the second mate called the roll. He called over the mate's watch first, and everyone answered. Then he came to ours, and he must have been much agitated, for the first name he sung out was Jocks. Among us there came a moment of dead silence, and I noticed the wail and moan of the wind aloft, and the flap of the 3 unfurled topgallant sails. The second mate called the next name, hurriedly. "Jasket," he sung out. "Sir," Jasket answered. "Coin." "Yes, sir." "Jessup." "Sir," I replied. "Stubbins." There was no answer. "Stubbins," again called the second mate. Again there was no reply. "Is Stubbins here? Anyone?" The second's voice sounded sharp and anxious. There was a moment's pause, then one of the men spoke. "He's not here, sir." Who saw him last?" the second asked. Plummer stepped forward into the light that streamed through the saloon doorway. He had on neither coat nor cap, and his shirt seemed to be hanging about him in tatters. "It were me, sir," he said. The old man, who was standing next to the second mate, took a pace towards him and stopped and stared, but it was the second who spoke. "Where?" he asked. "He were just above me, in their cross trees, when... The man broke off short. Yes, the second mate replied. Then he returned to the skipper. "Someone will have to go up, sir, and see," he hesitated. "But," the old man, and stopped. The second mate cut in. "I shall go up for one, sir," he said quietly. Then he turned back to the crowd of us. "Excuse me." "Jammy," he sung out, "get a couple of lamps out of the lamp locker." "Aye, sir," Tammy replied and ran off. "Now," said the second mate, addressing us, "I want a couple of men to jump along with me and take a look for Stubbins." Not a man replied. I would have liked to step out and offer, but the memory of that horrible clutch was with me, and, for the life of me, I could not summon up the courage.
"Come, come, men," he said. "We can't leave him up there. We shall take the lanterns. Who will come now?"
I walked out to the front. I was in a horrible funk, but, for very shame, I could not stand back any longer. "I'll come with you, sir," I said, not very loud, and feeling fairly twisted up with nervousness.
"That's more the tune, Jessup,"
he replied, in a tone that made me glad I stood out. At this point, Tammy came up with the lights. He brought them to the second, who took one, and told him to give the other to me. The second mate held his light above his head, and looked around at the hesitating men.
"Now, men," he sung out, "you're not going to let Jessup and me go alone. Come along, another one or two of you. Don't act like a damn lot of cowards."
Coin stood out and spoke for the crowd.
"I don't know as we're acting like cowards, sir. But just look at him."
He pointed at Plummer, who still stood full in the light from the saloon doorway.
"What sort of thing is it has done that, sir?"
he went on.
"And then you ask us to go up again? It aren't likely as we're in a hurry."
The second mate looked at Plummer, and surely, as I have mentioned before, the poor beggar was in a state. His ripped-up shirt was fairly flapping in the breeze that came through the doorway. The second looked, yet said nothing. It was as though the realization of Plummer's condition had left him without a word more to say. It was finally Plummer himself who broke the silence.
"I'll come with you, sir. Only you ought to have more light than them 2 lanterns. 'Twon't be no use unless we has plenty of light."
The man had grit, and I was astonished at his offering to go, after what he must have gone through. Yet, I was to have even greater astonishment, for abruptly, the skipper, who all this time had scarcely spoken, stepped forward a pace and put his hand on the second mate's shoulder.
"I'll come with you, Mr. Tulipson," he said.
The second mate twisted his head round and stared at him a moment, in astonishment. Then he opened his mouth.
"No, sir, I don't think," he began. "That's sufficient, Mr. Tulipson," the old man interrupted. "I've made up my mind."
He turned to the first mate, who had stood by without a word.
"Mr. Grange," he said, "take a couple of the prentices down with you, and pass out a box of blue lights and some flare-ups."
The mate answered something, and hurried away into the saloon, with the 2 prentices in his watch. Then the old man spoke to the men.
"Now, men," he began, "this is no time for dilly-dallying. The second mate and I will go aloft, and I want about a half-dozen of you to come along with us and carry lights. Plummer and Jessup here have volunteered. I want 4 or 5 more of you. Step out now, some of you."
There was no hesitation whatever now, and the first man to come forward was Coin. After him followed 3 of the mate's crowd, and then old Jasket.
That will do," said the old man.
He turned to the second mate.
"Has Mr. Grange come with those lights yet?"
he said, with a certain irritability.
"Here, sir,"
said the first mate's voice, behind him in the saloon doorway. He had the box of blue lights in his hand, and behind him came the two boys carrying the flares. The skipper took the box from him with a quick gesture and opened it.
"Now, one of you men, come here," he ordered.
One of the men in the mate's watch ran to him. He took several of the lights from the box and handed them out to the men.
"See here," he said, "when we go aloft, you get into the foretop and keep one of these going all the time. Do you hear?" "Yes, sir," replied the man. "You know how to strike them?" the skipper asked abruptly. "Yes, sir," he answered.
The skipper sung out to the second mate.
"Where's that boy of yours, Tammy, Mr. Tulipson?"
"Here, sir," said Tammy, answering for himself. The old man took another light from the box.
"Listen to me, boy," he said. "Take this and stand by on the fore-deck house. When we go aloft, you must give us light until the man gets his going in the top. You understand?"
"Yes, sir," answered Tammy, and took the light.
"1 minute,"
said the old man, and stooped and took a second light from the box.
Your first light may go out before we're ready. You'd better have another in case it does."
Tammy took the second light and moved away.
Those flares all ready for lighting there, Mr. Grange?"
the captain asked.
"All ready, sir,"
replied the mate. The old man pushed one of the blue lights into his coat pocket and stood upright.
"Very well," he said. "Give each of the men one apiece, and just see that they all have matches."
He spoke to the men particularly.
"As soon as we are ready, the other 2 men in the mate's watch will get up into the crane lines and keep their flares going. Take your paraffin tins with you. When we reach the upper top sails, Coin and Jasket will get out on the yard arms and show their flares there. Be careful to keep your lights away from the sails. Plummer and Jessup will come up with the second mate and myself. Does every man clearly understand?"
"Yes, sir," the men said in chorus. A sudden idea seemed to occur to the skipper, and he turned and went through the doorway into the saloon. In about a minute he came back and handed something to the second mate that shone in the light from the lanterns. I saw that it was a revolver, and he held another one in his hand, and he held another in his other hand, and this I saw him put into his side pocket. The second mate held the pistol a moment, looking a bit doubtful.
"I don't think, sir,"
but the skipper cut him short.
"You don't know," he said. "Put it in your pocket."
Then he turned to the first mate.
"You will take charge on the deck, Mr. Grange, while we're aloft," he said.
"Aye, aye, sir," the mate answered, and sung out to one of his prentices to take the blue light box back into the cabin. The old man turned and led the way forward. As we went, the light from the 2 lanterns shone up upon the decks, showing the litter of the topgallant gear. The ropes were foul of one another, and a regular bunch of buffers. This had been caused, I suppose, by the crowd trampling over them in their excitement. When they reached the deck, and then, suddenly, as though the sight had waked me up to a more vivid comprehension, it came to me new and fresh how damn strange was the whole business. I got a little touch of despair, and asked myself what was going to be the end of all these beastly happenings. Can you understand? Abruptly, I heard the skipper shouting, away forward. He was singing out to Tammy to get up onto the house with his blue light. We reached the fore rigging, and, the same instant, the strange ghastly flare of Tammy's blue light burst out into the night, causing every rope, sail, and spar to jump out weirdly. I saw now that the second mate was already in the starboard rigging, with his lantern. He was shouting to Tammy to keep the drip from his light clear of the staysail, which was stowed upon the house. Then, from somewhere on the port side, I heard the skipper shout to us to hurry.
"Smartly now, you men," he was saying. "Smartly now."
The man who had been told to take up the station on the foretop was just behind the second mate. Plummer was a couple ratlines lower. I caught the old man's voice again.
"Where's Jessup with the other lantern?" I heard him shout.
"Here, sir," I sung out.
"Bring it over this side," he ordered. "You don't want the 2 lanterns on one side."
I ran round the fore side of the house. Then I saw him. He was in the rigging and making his way smartly aloft. One of the mate's watch and Coin were with him. This I saw as I came round the house. Then I made a jump, gripped the sheer pole, and swung myself up onto the rail. And then, All at once, Tammy's blue light went out, and there came, what seemed by contrast, pitchy darkness. I stood where I was, one foot on the rail and my knee upon the sheer pole. The light from my lantern seemed no more than a sickly yellow glow against the gloom. And higher, some 40 or 50 feet, and a few ratlines below, the futtock rigging on the starboard side, there was another glow of yellowness in the night. Apart from these, all was blackness. And then from above, high above, there wailed down to the darkness a weird, sobbing cry. What it was, I do not know, but it sounded horrible. The skipper's voice came down jerkily.
"Smartly with the light, boy!"
he shouted, and the blue glare blazed out again, almost before he had finished speaking. I stared up at the skipper. He was standing where I had seen him before the light went out, and so were the two men. As I looked, he commenced to climb again. I glanced across to starboard. Jaskett and the other man in the mate's watch were about midway between the deck of the house and the foretop. Their faces showed extraordinary pale in the dead glare of the blue light. Higher, I saw the second mate in the futtock rigging, holding his light up over the edge of the top. Then he went further and disappeared. The man with the blue lights followed, and also vanished from view. On the port side, and more directly above me, the decks. They were filled with flickering, grotesque shadows cast by the dripping light above. A group of the men stood by the port galley door, their faces upturned and pale and unreal under the gleam of the light. Then I was in the futtock rigging, and a moment afterwards, standing in the top beside the old man. He was shouting to the men who had gone out on the crane line. It seemed that the man on the port side was bungling, but at least, nearly a minute after the other man had lit his flare, he got it going. In that time, the man in the top had lit his second blue light, and we were ready to get into the topmast rigging. First, however, the skipper leant over the after side of the top and sung out to the first mate to send a man up onto the forecastle head with the flare. The mate replied, and then we started again, the old man leading. Fortunately, the rain had ceased, and there seemed to be no increase in the wind. Indeed, if anything there appeared to be rather less. Yet, what there was drove the flames of the flares up out into occasional twisting serpents of fire, at least a yard long. About halfway up the topmast rigging, the second mate sung out to the skipper to know whether Plummer should light his flare. But the old man said he had better wait until we reached the cross trees, as then he could get out of the way from the gear to where there would be less danger of setting fire to anything. We neared the cross trees, and the old man stopped and sung out to me to pass him the lantern by coin. A few ratlines more, and both he and the second mate stopped almost simultaneously, holding their lanterns as high as possible, and peered up into the darkness.
"See any signs of him, Mr. Tulipson?" the old man asked. "No, sir," replied the second. "Not a sign."
He raised his voice.
"Stubbins!" he sung out. "Stubbins, are you there?"
We listened, but nothing came to us beyond the blowing moan of the wind and the flap of the bellying gallant above. The second mate climbed over the cross trees, and Plummer followed. The man got out by the royal backstay and lit his flare. By its light we could see plainly, but there was no vestige of Stubbins, so far as the light went.
"Get out onto the yard arms with those flares, you two men," shouted the skipper. "Be smart now. Keep them away from the sail."
The men got onto the foot ropes, Coin on the port, and thing. And then, as they drew near to the yard arms, they passed beyond the brilliance of the light, so that I could not see them clearly. A few seconds passed, and then the light from Coin's flare streamed out upon the wind. Yet nearly a minute went by, and there was no sign of Jaskets. Then, out from the semi-darkness at the starboard yard arm, there came a curse from Jasket, followed almost immediately by a noise of something vibrating.
"What's up?" shouted the second mate. "What's up, Jasket?" "It's their foot ropes, sir."
He drew out the last word into sort of a gasp. The second mate bent quickly with the lantern. I craned round after the after side of the topmast and looked.
"What's the matter, Mr. Tulipson?"
I heard the old man singing out. Out on the yard arm, Jasket began to shout for help, and then, all at once, in the light from the second mate's lantern, I saw that the starboard foot rope on the upper topsail yard was being violently shaken. Savagely shaken is perhaps a better word. And then, almost in the same instant, the second mate shifted the lantern from his right to his left hand. He put the right into his pocket and brought his gun out with a jerk. He extended his hand and arm, as though pointing at something a little below the yard. Then, a quick flash spat out across the shadows, followed immediately by a sharp, ringing crack. In the same moment, I saw that the foot rope ceased to shake.
Light your flare, Jasket," the second shouted. "Be smart now."
Out at the yard arm there came a splutter of a match, and then, straightway, a great spurt of fire as the flare took light.
"That's better, Jasket. You're all right now,"
the second mate called out to him.
"What is it, Mr. Tulipson?"
I heard the skipper ask. I looked up and saw that he had sprung across to where the second mate was standing. The second mate explained it to him, but he did not speak loud enough for me to catch what he said. I had been struck by Jasket's attitude when the light of his flare had first revealed him. He had been crouched with his right knee cocked over the yard and his left leg down between it and the foot rope, while his elbow had been crooked over the yard for support, as he was lighting the flare. Now, however, he had slid both feet back onto the foot rope and was lying on his belly over the yard, with the flare held a little below the head of the sail. It was thus, with the light being on the foreside of the sail, that I saw a small hole a little below the foot rope, through which a ray of light shone. It was onto the port side of the mast. To my right, Plummer's flares seemed to be dwindling. I glanced up at his face through the smoke. He was paying no attention to it. Instead, he was staring above his head.
Shove some paraffin onto it, Plummer," I called to him. "It'll be out in a minute."
He looked down quickly to the light and did as I suggested. Then he held it out at arm's length and peered up again into the darkness.
"See anything?"
asked the old man, suddenly observing his attitude. Plummer glanced at him with a start.
"It's the Royal, sir. It's all adrift." "What?" said the old man.
He was standing a few ratlines up the topgallant rigging, and he bent his body outwards to get a better look.
"Mr. Tulipson," he shouted, "do you know that the Royal's all adrift?" "No, sir," answered the second mate. "If it is, it's more of this devilish work." "It's adrift right enough," said the skipper,
and he and the second went a few ratlines higher, keeping level with one another. I had now got above the cross trees, and was just at the old man's heels. Suddenly he shouted out,
"There he is! Stubbins! Stubbins!" "Where, sir?" asked the second eagerly. "I can't see him." "There! There!" replied the skipper, pointing.
I leant out from the rigging and looked up along his back in the direction his finger indicated. At first I could see nothing. Then, slowly, there grew upon my sight a dim figure crouching upon the bunt of the royal and partly hidden by the mast. I stared, and gradually it came to me that there was a couple of them, and further out upon the yard a hump that might have been anything, and was only visible indistinctly among the flutter of the canvas.
"Stubbins!" the skipper sung out. "Stubbins, come down out of that! Do you hear me?"
But no one came, and there was no answer. "There's two," I began, but he was shouting again.
"Come down out of that! You damned well hear me!"
Still, there was no reply.
"I'm hanged if I can see him at all, sir,"
the second mate called out from his side of the mast.
"Can't see him," said the old man, now thoroughly angry. "I'll soon let you see him."
He bent down to me with the lantern.
"Catch hold, Jessup," he said,
which I did. Then he pulled the blue light from his pocket, and as he was doing so, I saw the second peek round the backside of the mast at him. Evidently, in the uncertain light, he must have mistaken the skipper's action, for all at once he shouted out in a frightened voice, "Don't shoot, sir! For God's sakes, don't shoot!"
"Shoot be damned!" exclaimed the old man. "Watch!"
He pulled off the cap of the light. "There's two of them, sir!" I called again to him.
"What?"
he said in a loud voice, and at the same instant he rubbed the end of the light across the cap, and it burst into flame. He held it up so that it lit the royal yard like day, and straightway a couple of shapes dropped silently from the royal onto the topgallant yard. At the same moment, the humped something, midway out upon the yard, rose up. It ran into the mast, and I lost sight of it.
"God!"
I heard the skipper gasp, as he fumbled in his side pocket. I saw the two figures which had dropped onto the topgallant run swiftly along the yard, one to the starboard, and the other to the port yard arms. On the other side of the mast, the second's pistol cracked out twice, sharply. Then, from over my head, the skipper fired twice, and then again. But with what effect, I could not tell. Abruptly, as he fired his last shot, I was aware of an indistinct something gliding down the starboard royal backstay. It was descending full upon Plummer, who, all unconscious of the thing, was staring towards the topgallant yard. "Look above you! Plummer!" I almost shrieked. "What? Where?" he called, and grabbed the stay and waved his flare excitedly. Down on the upper topsail yard, Coyne and Jaskett's voices rose simultaneously, and, in the identical instant, their flares went out. Then Plummer shouted, and his light went utterly. There were only the two lanterns. There were left only the two lanterns, and the blue light held by the skipper, and that, a few seconds afterward, finished and died out. The skipper and the second mate were shouting to the men upon the yard, and I heard them answer in shaky voices. Out on the cross trees, I could see by the light from my lantern that Plummer was holding in a dazed fashion to the backstay. "Are you all right, Plummer?" I called out.
"Yes,
he said after a little pause, and then he swore.
"Come in off the yard, you men!" the skipper was singing out. "Come in! Come in!"
Down on deck, I heard someone calling, but I could not distinguish the words. Above me, pistol in hand, the skipper was glancing about uneasily.
"Hold up that light, Jessup! I can't see!"
Below us, the men got off the yard into the rigging.
"Down on deck with you!" ordered the old man. "As smartly as you can!" Come in off there, plumber," sung out the second mate. "Get down with the others." "Down with you, Jessup," said the skipper, speaking rapidly. "Down with you!"
I got over the cross trees, and he followed. On the other side, the second mate was level with us. He had passed his lantern to Plummer, and I caught the glint of his revolver in his right hand. In this fashion, we reached the top. The man who had been stationed there with the blue lights had gone. Afterwards, I found that he went down on deck as soon as they were finished. There was no sign of the man with the flare on the starboard crane line. He also, I learnt later, had slid down one of the backstays onto the deck only a very short while before we reached the top. He swore that a great black shadow of a man had come suddenly upon him from aloft. When I heard that, I remembered the thing I had seen descending upon Plummer. Yet, the man who had gone out upon the port crane line, the one who had bungled with lighting of his flare, was still where we had left him, though his light was burning now but dimly.
"Come in out of that, you!" the old man sung out. "Smartly now, and get down on deck."
"Aye, aye, sir," the man replied, and started to make his way in. The skipper waited until he had gotten to the main rigging, and then he told me to get back down out of the top. He was in the act of following when, all at once, there rose a loud outcry on deck, and then came the sound of a man screaming.
"Get out of my way, Jessup!"
The skipper roared, and swung himself down alongside of me. I heard the second mate shout something from the starboard rigging. Then, we were all racing down as hard as we could go. I had caught a momentary glimpse of a man running from the doorway on the port side of the forecastle. In less than half a minute, we were upon the deck, and among a crowd of the men who were grouped around something. Yet, strangely enough, they were not looking at the thing among them, but away aft at something in the darkness. "It's on the rail!" cried several voices. "Overboard!" called somebody in an excited voice. "It's jumped over the side!"
"There weren't nothing,"
said a man in the crowd.
"Silence!" shouted the old man. "Where's the mate? What happened?" "Here, sir," called the first mate, shakily, from near the center of the group. "It's Jacob, sir. He... "What?" said the skipper. "What?" He's dead, I think," said the first mate in jerks. "Let me see," said the old man in a quieter tone.
The men had stood to one side to give him room, and he knelt beside the man on deck.
"Pass the lantern here,
Jessup," he said. I stood by him and held the light. The man was lying face downwards on the deck. Under the light from the lantern, the skipper turned him over and looked at him.
"Yes," he said after a short examination. "He's dead."
"Excuse me." He stood up and regarded the body a moment, in silence. Then, he turned to the second mate, who had been standing by during the last couple of minutes.
3,
he said in a grim undertone. The second mate nodded and cleared his voice. He seemed on the point of saying something, but then he turned and looked at Jacobs, and said nothing.
3, repeated the old man, "since 8 bells."
He stooped and looked again at Jacobs.
Poor devil, he muttered.
The second mate grunted some of the huskiness out of his throat, and spoke.
"Where must we take him?"
he asked quietly.
The 2 bunks are full. You'll have to put him down on the deck by the lower bunk, replied the skipper.
They carried him away. As they carried him away, I heard the old man make a sound that was almost a groan. The rest of the men had gone forward, and I do not think he realized that I was standing by him.
My God! Oh, my God! He muttered,
and began to walk slowly aft. He had cause enough for groaning. There were 3 dead, and Stubbins had gone utterly and completely. We never saw him again. Alright, what have I missed? Oh, I missed a bot. Let me take care of that real quick. Also, thank you, B, for popping by and leaving a lurk. I appreciate that. Do I want to become famous? No, I think I'm good. See ya. Nope. Close. Okay, stop. Okay, never mind. Alright. Chapter 12. The Council. A few minutes later, the second mate came forward again. I was still standing near the rigging, holding the lantern, but in an aimless sort of way.
That you, plumber? He asked.
No, sir, I said. It's Jessup.
Where's Plummer, then? He inquired.
I don't know, sir, I answered. I expect he's gone forward. Shall I go and tell him that you want him?
No, there's no need, he said. Tie your lamp up in the rigging, on the sheer pole there. Then go and get his, and shove it up on the starboard side. After that, you'd better go aft and give the 2 prentices a hand in the lamp locker.
Aye, aye, sir, I replied, and proceeded to do as he directed. After I had got the light from Plummer, and lashed it up to the starboard sheer pole, I hurried aft. I found Tammy and the other prentice in our watch, busy in the locker, lighting lamps. What are we doing? I asked. The old man's given orders to lash all the spare lamps we can find in the rigging, so as to have the decks light, said Tammy. And a damned good job, too. He handed me a couple of lamps, and took 2 himself. Come on, he said, and stepped out on deck. We'll fix these in the main rigging, and then I want to talk to you. What about the mizzen? I inquired. Oh, he replied. He, meaning the other apprentice, will see to that. Anyway, it'll be daylight directly. We shoved the lamps up onto the sheer poles, 2 on each side. Then he came across to me. Look here, Jessup, he said, without any hesitation. You'll have to jolly well tell the skipper and the second mate all you know about all this. How do you mean? I asked. Why, that's something about the ship herself, that's the cause of what's happened, he replied. If you'd only explained to the second mate when I told you to, this might never have been. But I don't know, I said. I may be all wrong. It's only an idea of mine. I have no proofs. Proofs, he cut in with. Proofs? What about tonight? We've had all the proofs I want. I hesitated before answering him. So have I, for that matter, I said at length. What I mean is, I've nothing that the skipper and the second mate would consider as proofs. They never listened seriously to me. They'd listen fast enough, he replied. After what's happened this watch, they'll listen to anything. Anyway, it's jolly well your duty to tell them. What could they do, anyway? I asked despondently. As things are going, we'll all be dead before another week is over at this rate. You tell them, he answered. That's what you've got to do. If you can only get them to realize that you're right, they'll be glad to put into the nearest port and send us all ashore. I shook my head. Well, anyway, They'll have to do something, he replied, in answer to my gesture. We can't go around the Horn with the number of men we've lost. We haven't enough to handle her. If it comes on to blow... You've forgotten, Tammy, I said. Even if I could get the old man to believe I'd got at the truth of the matter, he couldn't do anything. Don't you see? If I'm right, we couldn't even see the land. If we made it. We're like blind men. What on earth do you mean? He interrupted. How do you make out that we're like blind men? Of course we could see the land. Wait a minute, I said. You don't understand. Didn't I tell you? Tell what? He asked. About the ship I spotted? I said, I thought you knew. No, he said. When? Why, I replied, you know when the old man sent me away from the wheel? Yes, he answered. You mean in the morning watch the day before yesterday? Yes, I said. Well, don't you know what was the matter? No, he replied. That is, I heard you were snoozing at the wheel and the old man came up and caught you. That's all a darn silly yarn, I said. And then I told him the whole truth of the affair. After I had done that, I explained my idea about it to him. Now you see what I mean? I asked. You mean that this strange atmosphere, or whatever it is, we're in, would not allow us to see another ship? He asked, a bit awestruck. Yes, I said. But the point I wanted you to see is that if we can't see another vessel, even when she's quite close, then the same way we shouldn't be able to see land. To all intents and purposes, we're blind. Just you think of it. We're out in the middle of the briny doing a sort of eternal blind man's hop. The old man couldn't put into port even if he wanted to. He'd run us bang onto shore without ever seeing it. What are we going to do then? He asked in a despairing sort of way. Do you mean to say we can't do anything? Surely something can be done. It's terrible. For perhaps a minute, we walked up and down in the light of the different lanterns. Then he spoke again. We might be run down then, he said, and never even see the other vessel. It's possible, I replied, though, from what I saw, it's evident that we're quite visible, so that it would be easy for them to see us and steer clear of us, even though we couldn't see them. And we might run into something and never see it? He asked me, following up the train of thought. Yes, I said, only there's nothing to stop the other ship from getting in our way. But if it wasn't a vessel, he persisted, it might be an iceberg, or a rock, or even a derelict. In that case, I said, putting it a bit flippantly, naturally, we'd probably damage it. He made no answer to this, and for a few moments we were quiet. Then he spoke abruptly, as though the idea had come suddenly to him. Those lights the other night, he said. Were they a ship's light? Yes, I replied. Why? Why, he answered. Don't you see? If they were really lights, we could see them. Well, I should think I ought to know that, I replied. You seem to forget that the second mate slung me off the lookout for daring to do that very thing. I don't mean that, he said. Don't you see that if we could see them at all, it showed that the atmosphere thing wasn't round us then? Not necessarily, I answered. It may have been nothing more than a rift in it, though, of course, I may be all wrong. But anyway, the fact that the lights disappeared almost as soon as they were seen shows us that it was very much round the ship. That made him feel a bit the way I did, and when next he spoke, his tone had lost its hopefulness. Then, you think it'll be no use telling the second mate and the skipper anything? He asked. I don't know, I replied. I've been thinking about it, and it can't do any harm. I have a very good mind to. I should, he said. You needn't be afraid of anybody laughing at you, you know. It might do some good. You've seen more than anyone else. He stopped in his walk and looked around. Wait a minute, he said, and ran off aft a few steps. I saw him look up at the break of the poop, and then he came back. Come along now, he said. The old man's up on the poop, talking to the second mate. You'll never catch a better chance. Still, I hesitated, but he caught me by the sleeve and almost dragged me to the lee ladder. All right, I said when I got there. All right, I'll come. Only I'm hanged if I know what to say when I get there. Just tell them you want to speak with them, he said. They'll ask you what you want, then you spit it all out, you know. They'll find it interesting enough. You'd better come too, I suggested. You'll be able to back me up in a lot of things. I'll come fast enough, he replied. You go up. I went up the ladder and walked across to where the skipper and second mate stood talking earnestly by the rail. Tammy kept behind. As I came near to them, I caught the 2 or 3 words, though I attached no meaning to them. They were, "Send him for," and then the 2 of them turned back and looked at me, and the second mate asked what I wanted. "I want to speak to you and the old captain, sir," I answered. "What is it, Jessup?" the skipper inquired. "I scarcely know how to put it, sir," I said. It's about these things." "What things? Speak out, man," he said. "Well, sir," I blurted out, "there's some dreadful things come aboard the ship since we left port." I saw him give one quick glance at the second mate, and the second looked back. Then the skipper replied. "How do you mean, come aboard?" he asked. "Out of the sea, sir," I said. "I've seen them. So's Tammy here." "Ah!" he exclaimed, and it seemed to me from his face he was understanding something better. "Out of the sea!" Again, he looked at the second mate. The second was staring at me. "Yes, sir," I said. "It's the ship. She's not safe. I've watched. I think I understand a bit, but there's a lot I don't." I stopped. The skipper had turned to the second mate. The second nodded, gravely. Then I heard him mutter in a low voice, and the old man replied, after which he turned to me again. "Look here, Jessup. I'm going to talk straight with you. You strike me as being a cut above the ordinary shellback. I think you've sense enough to hold your tongue." "I've got my mate's ticket, sir," I said simply. Behind me, I heard Tammy give a little start. He had not known about it until then. The skipper nodded. "So much the better," he answered. "I may have to speak to you about that later on." He paused, and the second mate said something to him in an undertone. "Yes," he said, as though in reply to what the second had been saying. Then he spoke to me again. "You've seen things come out of the sea, you say?" he questioned. "Now just tell me all you can remember from the very beginning." I set to it and told him everything in detail, commencing with the strange figure that had stepped aboard out of the sea, and continuing my yarn up to the things that had happened in that very watch. I stuck well to the solid facts, and now and then he and the second mate would look at one another and nod. At the end, he turned to me with an abrupt gesture. "You still hold, then, that you saw a ship the other morning, when I sent you from the wheel?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. "I most certainly do." "But you knew there wasn't any," he said. "Yes, sir," I replied in an apologetic tone. "There was, and, if you will let me, I believe that I can explain it a bit." "Well," he said, "go on." Now that I knew he was willing to listen to me in a serious manner, all my funk of telling him had gone, and I went ahead and told him my ideas about the mist, and the thing it seemed to have ushered, you know. I finished up by telling him how Tammy had worried me to come and tell what I knew. "He thought then, sir," I went on, "that you might wish to put into the nearest port, but I told him that I didn't think you could, even if you wanted to." "How's that?" he asked, profoundly interested. Well, sir, I replied, if we are unable to see other vessels, we shouldn't be able to see the land. You'd be piling the ship up, even without ever seeing where you were putting her. This view of the matter affected the old man in an extraordinary manner, as it did, I believe, the second mate, and neither spoke for a moment. Then the skipper burst out. "By God, Jessup," he said, "if you're right, the Lord have mercy on us." He thought for a couple of seconds. Then he spoke again, and I could see that he was pretty well twisted up. "My God, if you're right!" The second mate spoke.
"The men mustn't know, sir," he warned. "It'd be a mess if they did."
"Yes," said the old man. He spoke to me.
"Remember that, Jessup. Whatever you do, don't go yarning about this forward."
"No, sir," I replied.
"And you too, boy," said the skipper. "Keep your tongue between your teeth. We're in a bad enough mess without your making it worse. Do you hear?"
"Yes, sir," answered Tammy. The old man turned to me again.
"These things, or creatures that you say come out of the sea," he said. "You've never seen them except after nightfall?" he asked.
"Have you anything to propose, Mr. Tulipson?" he asked.
"Well, sir," replied the second mate, "I think you ought to have her snugged down every night before dark."
He spoke with considerable emphasis. Then he glanced aloft, and jerked his head in the direction of the unfurled topgallants.
"It's a damn good thing, sir," he said, "that it didn't come on to blow any harder."
The old man nodded again.
"Yes," he remarked, "we shall have to do it, but God knows when we'll get home."
"Better late than not at all," I heard the second mutter under his breath. Out loud he said,
"And the lights, sir?"
"Yes," said the old man.
"I will have the lamps in the rigging every night after dark."
"Very good, sir," assented the second. Then he turned to us.
"It's getting daylight, Jessup," he remarked, with a glance at the sky. "You'd better take Tammy with you and shove those lamps back into the locker."
"Aye, aye, sir," I said, and went down off the poop with Tammy. Chapter 13. The Shadow in the Sea. Give me a moment while I close my window. When 8 bells went at 4 o'clock, and the other watch came on deck to relieve us, it had been broad daylight for some time. Before we went below, the second mate had the 3 topgallants set, and now that it was light, we were pretty curious to have a look aloft, especially for up the fore, and Tom, who had been up to overhaul the gear, was questioned a lot. When he came down, as to whether there were any signs of anything queer up there. But he told us there was nothing unusual to be seen. At 8 o'clock, when we came on deck for the 8 to 12 watch, I saw the sailmaker coming forward along the deck, from the second mate's old berth. He had his rule in hand, and I knew he had been measuring the poor beggars in there, for their burial outfit. From the breakfast time until near noon, he worked shaping out 3 canvas wrappers from some old sailcloth. Then, with the aid of the second mate and one of the hands, he brought out the 3 dead chaps on to the after hatch, and there sewed them up, with a few lumps of holy stone at their feet. He was just finishing when 8 bells went, and I heard the old man tell the second mate to call his hands aft for the burial. This was done in one of the gangways unshipped. We had no decent grating big enough, so they had to get off one of the hatches and use it instead. The wind had died away during the morning, and the sea was almost a calm, the ship lifting ever so slightly to an occasional glassy heave. The only sounds that struck on the ear were the soft, slow rustle and occasional shiver of the sails, and the continuous and monotonous creak of the spars and gears at the gentle movements of the vessel. And it was in this solemn half-quietness that the skipper read the burial service. They put the Dutchman first upon the hatch. I could tell him by his stumpiness. And when at last the old man gave the signal, the second mate tilted his end, and he slid off, and down into the dark. "Poor old Dutchy," I heard one of the men say, and I fancy we all felt a bit like that. Then they lifted Jacobs onto the hatch, and when he had gone, Jock. When Jock was lifted, a sudden shiver ran through the crowd. He had been a favorite in a quiet way, and I know I felt, all at once, just a bit queer. I was standing by the rail upon the after bollard, and Tammy was next to me, while Plummer stood a little behind. As the second mate tilted the hatch for the last time, a little hoarse chorus broke from the men. "So long, Jock! So long, Jock!" And then, at the sudden plunge, they rushed to the side to see the last of him as he went downwards. Even the second mate was not able to resist this universal feeling, and he too peered over. From where I had been standing, I had been able to see the body take the water, and now, for a brief couple seconds, I saw the white of the canvas, blurred by the blue of the water, dwindle and dwindle in the extreme depth. Abruptly, as I stared, it disappeared. Too abruptly, it seemed to me. "Gone!" I heard several voices say, and then our watch began to go slowly forward, while one or two of the other started to replace the hatch. Tammy pointed and nudged me. "See, Jessup," he said. "What is it?" "What?" I asked. "That queer shadow," he replied. "Look!" And then I saw what he meant. It was something big and shadowy that appeared to be growing clearer. It occupied the exact place, so it seemed to me, in which Jock had disappeared. "Look at it!" said Tammy again. "It's getting bigger!" He was pretty excited, and so was I. I was peering down, and the thing seemed to be rising out of the depths. It was taking shape. As I realized what the shape was, a queer, cold funk took me. "See?" said Tammy. "It's just like the shadow of a ship." And it was. The shadow of a ship rising out of the unexplored immensity beneath our keel. Plummer, who had not yet gone forward, caught Tammy's last remark and glanced over. "What's he mean?" he asked. "That!" replied Tammy and pointed. I jabbed my elbow into his ribs, but it was too late. Plummer had seen it. Curiously enough, though, he seemed to think nothing of it. "That ain't nothing 'cept the shader the ship," he said. Tammy, after my hint, let it go at that. But when Plummer had gone forward with the others, I told him not to go telling everything around the decks like that. "We've got to be thundering careful," I remarked. "You know what the old man said last watch." "Yes," said Tammy. I wasn't thinking. I'll be careful next time." A little way from me, the second mate was still staring down into the water. I turned and spoke to him. "What do you make it out to be, sir?" I asked. "God knows," he said, with a quick glance round to see whether any of the men were about. He got down from the rail and turned to go up onto the poop. At the top of the ladder, he leant over the break. You may as well ship that gangway, you two," he told us.
And mind, Jessup, keep your mouth shut about this."
"Aye, aye, sir," I answered.
"And you too, youngster," he added,
and went up aft along the poop. Tammy and I were busy with the gangway when the second came back. He had brought the skipper.
"Right under the gangway, sir,"
I heard the second say, and pointed down into the water. For a little while the old man stared. Then I heard him speak.
I don't see anything," he said.
At that, the second mate bent more forward and peered down. So did I, but the thing, whatever it was gone completely.
"It's gone, sir," the second said. It was there right enough when I came for you."
About a minute later, having finished shipping the gangway, I was going forward when the second's voice called me back.
"Tell the captain what it was you just saw now," he said in a low voice.
I can't say exactly, sir," I replied, but it seemed to me like the shadow of a ship rising up through the water.
"There, sir," remarked the second to the old man. "Just what I told you."
The skipper stared at me.
"You're quite sure?"
he asked. "Yes, sir," I answered. "Tammy saw it too." I waited a minute. Then they turned to go aft. The second was saying something. "Can I go, sir?" I asked.
"Yes, that'll do, Jessup,"
he said over his shoulder. But the old man came back to the break and spoke to me.
"Remember, not a word of this forward,"
he said. "No, sir," I replied, and went back to the second mate. And he went back to the second mate, while I walked forward to the forecastle to get something to eat.
"You're waxing the kettle, Jessup,"
said Tom as I stepped over the washboard.
"And I got your lime juice in a pannikin."
"Thanks," I said, and sat down. As I stowed away my grub, I took no notice of the chatter of the others. I was too stuffed with my own thoughts. That shadow of a vessel rising, out of the profound deeps, had impressed me tremendously. It had not been imagination. 3 of us had seen it. Really 4, for Plummer distinctly saw it, though he failed to recognize it as anything extraordinary. As you can understand, I thought a lot about this shadow of a vessel. But I am sure, for a time, my ideas must have gone in an everlasting, blind circle. And then I got another thought, for I got thinking of the figures I had seen aloft in the early morning, and I began to imagine fresh things. You see, that first thing that had come up over the side had come out of the sea. It had gone, and it had gone back. And now there was this shadow vessel thing. Ghost ship, I called it. It was a damned good name, too. And the dark, noiseless men. I thought a lot on these lines. Unconsciously, I put a question to myself aloud. Were they the crew?
"Eh?"
said Jasket, who was on the next chest. I took hold of myself, as it were, and glanced at him in an apparently careless manner. "Did I speak?" I asked.
"Yes, mate,"
he replied, eyeing me curiously.
"You said something about a crew."
"I must have been dreaming," I said, and rose up to put away my plate. 14. The Ghost Ships. At 4 o'clock, when again we went on the deck, the second mate told me to go on with a punch mat I was making, while Tammy he sent to get out his sinnet. I had the mat slung on the fore side of the main mast, between it and the after end of the house, and, in a few moments, Tammy brought his sinnet and yarns to the mast, and made fast to one of the pins. "What do you think it was, Jessup?" he asked, abruptly after a short silence. I looked at him. "What do you think?" I replied. "I don't know what to think," he said, "but I've a feeling that it's something to do with all the rest." He indicated aloft with his head. I've been thinking too, I remarked. That is? He inquired. Yes. That scene down in the sea. Good Lord! He exclaimed, as he got my meaning, and then, for a little, he stood and thought. That's where they live, you mean? He said, at last, and paused again. Well, I replied, it can't be the sort of existence we should call life. He nodded, doubtfully. No, he said, and was silent again. Presently, he put out an idea that had come to him. You think, then, that vessel has been with us for some time? If we'd only known? He asked. All along, I replied. I mean, ever since these things started. Supposing there are others, he said suddenly. I looked at him. If there are, I said, you can pray to God that they won't stumble across us. It strikes me that whether they're ghosts or not ghosts, they're blood-gutted pirates. It seems horrible, he said solemnly, to be talking seriously like this about such things. I've tried to stop thinking that way, I told him. I felt I should go cracked if I didn't. There's damned queer things happening at sea. I know, but this isn't one of them.